Then welcome everyone. This is the third meeting of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee talking about waterway leases, licenses, and registration for the Department of State Lands. So thanks to everyone for joining today. And thanks to, we have lots of interested parties that have joined. Really appreciate you being on the line. This will be a meeting mostly for the Rulemaking Advisory Committee to have their discussion and provide their input to the department. And then we'll have time towards the end for interested parties to make some brief comments as well. But thank you for being here and for staying in listening mode. I'm Sylvia Chiborowski, and I'm the facilitator for this Rulemaking Advisory Committee. Let's go to the next slide. I'll just go through some background information, then we can jump in. So today we have a few key topics for discussion. First, we're going to talk about the draft rules on lease rates and application fees. So this really, we're devoting lots of time here to talk about the new proposed method to calculate lease rates and to update the application fees. This is a topic that RAC members got a pretty lengthy presentation on this at the last meeting, and we didn't have a lot of time for discussion. So today we're devoting a really good chunk of time to get y'all all of your input on the lease rate calculations and application fees. And we'll have some discussion questions and topics to help guide that discussion, but we really want to focus on that today. And then after a break, we're going to briefly touch on financial assurances. This is a really minor part of the rules, but we want to give it a little bit of time, and the department will provide their proposed language for how to deal with financial assurances. And then we're going to get some background on a new topic today. So Justin with DSL is going to provide some background on updated rules for the process to review applications for new and renewed leases. So you'll get some background context on that. We'll probably have a little bit of time for Q&A and a little bit discussion, but we really want to provide that presentation today so that you can consider it. And then at the next meeting, you'll have more time to actually talk about that topic and provide your input. And then we'll have time for interested party comments towards the end, and then just end with next steps and reminders of what we're going to be doing at the next meeting. So that's our agenda for today. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so just some reminders about our Zoom protocols. When we get into our discussion, especially since we have a lot of people on the line, we'll just ask you to raise your hand to get in the queue if we have a lot of people that are wanting to speak, and you can just find that button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you click on the react button, the raise hand feature is right in there. I don't think we have anyone by phone only, but if we do, then press *9 to get in the queue. I'll try to hear from as many people as possible and kind of have a balance of speaking time. And if you have any issues with the Zoom platform, just send a message in the chat and we'll get to you. And then throughout the conversation, just keep your mic muted when you're not speaking to reduce background noise. And we always love it when people are using their video, especially when they're speaking, so that we can pretend like we're in a room together. And just be respectful of each other and our staff here. All right, next slide. Okay, I think that was it for what I'm going to cover today. And and actually, I'll just make a note too that that we sent over a meeting packet with a link to the rules and documents that we'll be covering today. So I think Danielle, maybe if she can put those links in the chat, just so that you all have it if you want to look at it on your own. That way, you know, if you want to see a bit more, you'll have that right in front of you. Okay, so I think that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Blake Helm at DSL for just a few updates on the process, and then we can dive in.
Excellent. Thank you, Sylvia. So first off, thanks to you, RAC members, for lots of things, but specifically for submitting requests for calculating those annual rents under the proposed, rules. I believe we've answered all of the requests, but if there are any lingering, feel free to let us know, and we'll happy to provide, those. What annual rents may look like under the proposed rules. All right, so as a reminder, here are the remaining topics. I wanted to go over the remaining topics for the next 3 RAC meetings. So it doesn't include what we're going over today and assumes that there won't be any um, yeah. So 5 topics: application review process for new and renewal applications. We're going to get the introduction for that today. We'll talk about the general provisions and lease conditions rule, and then we'll also review our new application forms, our waterway use authorization templates that we're updating, our customer communication plan, and then we still will need to go over fiscal impact and racial equity statements. And so those will be the topics that we'll go over for the remaining 3 RAC meetings. We also, if need be, can have an additional RAC. What would that be? April, or is that May? I think we have
Yeah,
the
April.
possibility of going into April if needed. So next slide, please.
And actually, Blake, before you go into the
Oh, yeah.
next big topic, maybe let's do a quick round of introductions from RAC members, especially for the benefit of members of the public here, so you know who's on the RAC. So let's go to Alan and then Dylan.
Hi, I'm Alan Hansen. I'm Policy and Environmental Manager for the Oregon State Marine Board.
Hi, everyone. Dylan Paul, City of Portland Real Estate Services.
Thanks. And then Elizabeth and Garrett. I think I saw Elizabeth on the line.
Hi. Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I work with Columbia Crossings and Marina Island.
Hey, I'm Garrett Phillips. I work for Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force in Astoria.
Perfect. Then let's go to Jim Ryan and then John.
I am Jim Ryan. I represent the waterfront organizations of Oregon, and I'm a floating home owner at Jansen Beach, Morridge.
Morning, my name is John High. I work with RAC Maritime and RAC Tongue Point in Astoria, Oregon, and we are a commercial facility for ship repair.
Thanks, John. And then let's go to Justin and Laurel.
My name is Justin Deutsch. I'm with Columbia Crossings.
Morning, everybody. Laurel Hellman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department.
And Lindsay and then Mike.
Good morning. I'm Lindsay Hutchison, and I'm the staff attorney for Willamette Riverkeeper.
Good morning, Mike Dunning, COO, Port Coos Bay, representing Oregon Public Ports Association.
Thank you, Mike. And Jim Zimmer, you just joined. We just finished our round of intros, so you get to go now.
Good morning. I'm Jim Zimmer with Douglas County. My department runs Salmon Harbor Marina in Winchester Bay, and we have about 100 acres submerged land lease.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Oh, and actually, let's go to Glenn as well. Glenn Dolphin as the alternate.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. Glenn Dolphin here with the Oregon State Marine Board. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for joining, Glenn. And then from staff, let's just do a quick hello from Blake, Justin, and Danielle.
Howdy, Blake Helm, proprietary specialist for the Oregon Department of State Lands. Be facilitating the discussion on lease compensation today.
And I'm Justin Russell. I'm a proprietary coordinator at the department.
Danielle Boudreau, rulemaking coordinator. I shepherd the process along, and then during these meetings provide technical support and grunt work. So welcome, everyone.
All right, thank you. And thanks again to members of the public that are here. Appreciate you joining. Okay, well, let's get into our first topic. So Blake's going to just provide a little bit of a reminder on what we're talking about when we talk about the lease compensation, what DSL is trying to achieve through updating the lease compensation formula, and then we'll have plenty of time for RAC discussion. Over to you, Blake.
Thank you, Sylvia. Here we are. We've gone over this a couple of times, and I'm sure you've seen it in a number of emails. But these are our, objectives that we are trying to accomplish with our changes, our proposed changes to lease compensation method. We're trying to create a single method for calculating rent. To charge a reasonable market-based rate, right, for use of public lands, to discontinue the use of gross revenue for determining rent, and to allow fees and rent to increase over time, thereby accounting for inflation and other market increases, and to mitigate negative impacts to lessee as DSL transitions to a new method. All right, so as to kind of begin, this discussion, I broke these down into about 5 or 6 different sub topics. I think a hot topic for us is the use of adjacent land value for determining rent, and I think that is a great place for us to start. And we've heard lots of input from RAC members about the use of adjacent land value and its justification. But I really would want to open this up to RAC members because there are many thoughts and concerns and issues that I know that you guys have. And so I open the floor. Let's talk about adjacent land value for determining rent. What concerns do we have? Are there other methods which we should consider, and what the justification of those methods would be? So who is the brave one today and wants to kind of kick this off?
I think that the outstanding questions that I left last meeting with, and then I've seen kind of floating since we met last, still have to do with pinning down the valuation method, because it looks like that right now there's not a clear understanding of how you really get down to a valuation that is predictable and forecastable, and where does it cap? And then it comes also back to the modifier over time. We talked about CPI versus not CPI and reasons for that, but I don't think we went from there as far as looking at where do you come down to a fair market value cap on increases over time.
Yeah, and those are definitely topics that we want to get into, but my thinking was, a big point of a bottleneck would be, what is the basis for determining rent, whether it's a flat rate, whether it's adjacent value. And it seems like, RAC members have concerns with the use of adjacent land value. So I wanted to talk about that first, but we do have time to discuss annual increases and what a good methodology or a good index to use would be. So I appreciate it, John, but I do want to focus on adjacent land value now. So
I don't think I was clear. The adjacent land value is part of that discussion, because the valuation method pivoting off of adjacent land value, it's not a clear, to me at least, it's not a clear methodology that lets you sit down and say, okay, if I have this much submerged land lease in this location, how do I approximate what I'm looking at on a lease valuation based on adjacent land value? Because that runs the gamut up and down the river.
yeah, and that valuation is determined by the county, whatever the real market value is, and so there is. Well, I see a number of hands, so why don't we see if anybody has any comments about what John's bringing up. Garrett, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I guess, to silo the topics and just focus on adjacent land value. I mean, it seems super imprecise and imperfect, but I looked into like alternative ways that you could do that, meeting your objective of having a uniform method. And it doesn't, I don't see other ways of doing it necessarily that meet that objective that are any better. It captures sort of geographic variation and value across the state to some extent. Yeah, it's like, it's imprecise but I don't know what else you would do. So I'm okay with it, basically. And it would be, I'm interested to hear if anybody else has other ways that meet the objective.
Yeah, that's great, Garrett. Thank you. And maybe turning back to John, I'm curious if you did think that there might be a different method other than adjacent land value that would be a clearer valuation method. And then we'll go to, I think it was Alan that had his hand up earlier.
I think that there's, the adjacent land values got me kind of flummoxed a little bit because of the difference between industrial and residential adjacent lands. Coming from a previous location where this came up, adjacent land value in industrial zones that are bordered by residential, they can get super inflated super fast, and it does not necessarily translate to value for an industrial operator. And then that also translates to recreational operators if you're in an area where you have high value residential land overlooking the water, which can extremely inflate. I don't necessarily believe that that translates in a fair manner in all locations. That's why I bring it up as a major concern.
Okay, that's helpful, John.
Yeah,
So
that very helpful. Thank you, John. I appreciate that clarification. And so perhaps there are methods in which we could account for that, John. You mentioned a cap. Are you saying there should be a cap in what the value of the adjacent land should be?
Well, the value of the adjacent land is subject to market fluctuations, right? So if you sit there and look at, I want to go purchase a piece of land at any given time, that's going to be dependent on a great many things. So if you evaluate a section of waterfront or submerged lease adjacent to someplace in downtown Portland right now, you're going to get a number. And if you do the same thing when the market shifts with interest rates, you're going to get a different number. So do you just simply follow market rate, or do you look at some evaluation between is it reasonable to go out and charge full market value on somebody that's trying to do a business that doesn't necessarily I'm trying to be precise here, but let's look at a legacy business that's operating that has dependency on a submerged land lease. That legacy business is in a situation where typically you're trying to manage costs from getting out of control because you're trying to keep a business either stable or growing. That may not be the focus of every user here, obviously, but it does bear very much on any private or semi-private operator that's dependent on water access. So if over time you have more interest in residential expansion or something like that on the land adjacent to you, you're kind of stuck with whatever that land value does as it grows, and as the pressures on that market change, where your market may not necessarily follow that. That's what I'm trying to get to here, is that you can quickly put a user of the lease at a disadvantage if you're following real estate without any kind of a modifier on that.
Yeah. Well, couple things I'd like to add perhaps to that. We do look at adjacent land value, but by design, the formula essentially ends up only taking 3 to 8% of the value of the land to create a rate. You know, that is the rental rate, those modifier that, you know, changes are changed with the modifier. So it is not using the full adjacent land value. That's a starting off point, and we take 3 to 8% of that to come up with a rate that would be multiplied by the authorized area. So you know, there is a mitigating factor in the in the formula. And anecdotally, I would say in, you know, 2008 era, when we saw the downturn, you know, when real estate market really, you know, took a dive, a lot of, you know, lessees benefited substantially from the reduced rates, either because, you know, they were repairing, you know, they used a repairing land value method, and, you know, their, you know, adjacent land value went down, or, you know, the formula tipped for them, and you know, they benefit. But in large, a lot of people that went for renewals benefited from you know, the downturn in the real estate market. So it will go both ways using adjacent land value. If market rate is going down, then lessees will end up benefiting from that and see their rates go down, you know, because we're using the adjacent land value. So, all right, I don't know the order
I think
here
I
for the
can do this,
hands. You
Blake.
can? Okay, appreciate it,
Well, I
Sylvia.
want to make sure, because there were a few hands up too, and I want to make sure that you got a chance to. So let's go to Alan first. I know your hand went down, but I want to check in with you.
So I just threw my question in the chat because it
Oh.
was kind of unrelated. But to kind of address some of John's concerns, or to ask questions following up with John's concerns, I guess I consider DSL to be, in this scenario, kind of a equivalent to a commercial landowner. And on land, you have the same issue where if you have a legacy business in a popular area, their rent's going to increase based on the value of the area. So I'm curious, is that something that should be considered? Or how is a commercial, you know, marine type business different than a, you know, a standard land-based commercial lease?
Okay, so for you, Alan, it kind of makes sense that the rates would increase if the area becomes popular. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, it would be a traditional market pressures. I mean, the waterway should see a similar pressure to what the land would see. So you know, I'm not a businessman, so I'm not quite sure why we should treat the waterway values different than the private industry would impact land values for commercial properties.
Well,
that is a great question, Alan. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, somebody was about to jump in with an answer. I don't want to stop them.
well, I'm going to quit talking here, but to answer that point, the difference on the primary difference on that, to your question, would be on a commercial business that's land based. Typically, you'd be able to have full control of a lease or property other than taxing without you'd be working with a bank, or you'd own the ground or land outright. In this case, you don't have that. You are limited to what the agreement with the state would be for the water lease that you're dependent on to operate. So basically that comes down to a different, it equates to basically a limited rights issue on the ground that you're trying to take care of, that, or trying to operate on. It's not quite the same as just seeing your property value go up and seeing a tax come with that. This is a bit nuanced from that, actually.
I understand ownership, but from a commercial lease situation, because I know not all business owners own the property underneath them. And so the leaseholder would be subject to those same market pressures.
with caps on how long that that agreement would be standing for, right? So you would be able to cap and forecast your cost of that lease over a defined term, whether it be 5 years or 50 years, but you know what that would be.
Yeah.
And I would want to jump in that the lease would do that, John, because it has a term and you would have a set lease and it would, you know, have a set trajectory. You know, there'd be a start and an end to that. So you would be able to calculate what is your rent over a period of time and know, you know, this is when it started and, you know, this is when the term ends and my rent will be this on year 1, this on year 2, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. And before we go to the other hands, which I think it's Justin, Jim, and then Dylan, Justin, Russell, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, I just kind of currently we're proposing a calculation based on the real market value of the land. And I wonder if maybe John's issues, you know, might be addressed by potentially exploring using like the appraised value. That's generally something that's limited, you know, by ballot measures of increases year over year. And, you know, obviously different counties do it different ways, but it might, you know, help alleviate some of the concerns John's talking about. So maybe just something to think about.
Yep. No, that's a really good thing to pick to point out. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Yeah, and maybe others, if while you're making comments, if you have thoughts on using appraised value instead of market value, that would be helpful too. But I'll go to Justin Twish first and then to Jim and Dylan.
Hey, good morning. So I guess there's this notion of market value. So market value is obviously what someone is willing to pay to purchase submerged land. That is what that is market value. There's this notion that I don't understand, no one has even attempted to defend, but is implicit in the proposal, that the market value of submerged land is equivalent to the market value of the adjacent terrestrial land, right? And that's not true. And if you think about it for 1 second, the value of unimproved, unentitled, submerged land is a fraction of the value of, you know, zoned and entitled, or zoned, let's say, adjacent land. Why? Because the process of building improvements to meet current code, the entitling those improvements, permitting those improvements is so expensive, and the use are so limited. There's 3 uses really. I mean, you could, setting aside industrial for a second, you could do floating homes, boat houses, or uncovered moorage. Those are the 3 uses. That's it. So on adjacent land, if you have zoning, first of all, there's a pretty well-established process for building buildings. And I can build an apartment building, I can build a condominium, I can build a McDonald's, whatever, right? On submerged land, you're quite constrained. And the reason, and you know, the proof is in the pudding, which is almost no new dock has been built in the last decade under existing laws, right? I mean, very little, right? So, you know, I spoke to an appraiser at Cushman & Wakefield who performed our appraisal for some of our marinas, and he said, okay, well, there's some precedents that he's familiar with where it's like 10% or something of the adjacent land value. The truth is, defining what the economic value of unimproved submerged land is extremely difficult. So the idea that the adjacent terrestrial land is the same, I don't think anyone has attempted to justify that. And then we get, and this flaw in the formula that has been proposed is so bad that if you look at our situation, and we got estimates from DSL about how much our leases would go up if uncapped. Well, the lease would, this is for our Jansen Bay Marina, which probably has some of the highest moorage rates in the state because it's covered per square foot. we would forfeit it because it would go from 33,000 to, I think it was like 1.6 or 1.8 million, which exceeds not just the net operating income from that property, but it exceeds the revenue from the property. So we would say, cheers, right? So it's only, you know, the reason why it's palatable is, or not palatable, but the reason why we wouldn't is because of these caps. So effectively, forget market land or market value or anything else. The default is we're just subject to the caps, which still, but then the caps create a huge amount of inequity. I think that could be acknowledged because, you know, everyone is effectively going to have the same rate for every lease, big or small. So anyway, that I just don't understand how no one has said, wait a second, submerged land, we're going to, like, it doesn't make sense to deem submerged land as having the equivalent value of adjacent land. That, like, we just need to go away from. In terms of alternatives, look, the first thing that we need to do, I think, if market rate is something that we want, then we have to determine, okay, what is the market value of unimproved, unentitled submerged land? I don't actually know. It's pretty difficult to determine, right? We could talk to appraisers. We could, I don't know. We you know, it'd be very difficult. But that is, if you want a market rate, you know, that's what you'd have to do. I think that, frankly speaking, it's impractical, and that we should basically go to a flat rate with a two-tiered system of saying, okay, this is in a premium location, and this is not in a premium location, and then have escalators that are a function of how well maintained and how sustainable and how that leaseholder contributes to the upkeep and conservation of habitat in our waterways. But I mean, again, like the idea that we can have a market rate for something that we don't know what the value is. I mean, I don't think that is viable. That's just my thought.
Great, thank you.
Understood. Thank you, Justin. Well, I do want to point out again that the value of the submerged and submersible land is not equivalent to the adjacent land. That is why we have the rental rate of 3 to 8%. So we are taking effectively 3 to 8% of the value of the adjacent land to form a rate, right, that we would apply to the authorized area. So if we had said that they are equivalent, then we would be using the full adjacent land value to determine the rent.
No, you couldn't, because
but we're not. We're using 3 to 8%.
Yeah, but if you use, so you're saying that if you use the full value, then it would be 100%?
Well,
so
I
that
mean,
means that my lease rate would be 100% of the value.
And that's what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying, Justin. What I'm saying is the formula that we've designed only takes 3 to 8% of the value of the adjacent land, right? So
let me ask you a question. Let's say that they were, let's say that they were equivalent, hypothetically. What would be the appropriate percentage?
Well, I mean, if you're saying that the submerged and submersible land is equivalent to the adjacent land, then why wouldn't you use the square foot value? And
because I have to pay that every year.
Yeah, and we would adjust that over the term. But what we felt like was the 3 to 8% was taking a percentage of the adjacent land to determine the value of the submerged and submersible land, and that's how we have designed the formula. And we can talk about the percentage that we use and say the rental rate maybe should be a different value and maybe should be a different range. But what we're not trying to do is say that adjacent land value is the equivalent of submerged and submerged. What we're trying to take is a percentage of the adjacent land value. And you have to determine what the adjacent land value is to take a percentage of it.
So I would just note that, like, a lot of times with ground leases, they are something like 3% of the land value or something like that. That's why it kind of implicit in this is the equivalents, right? Because that's not an unusual market rate would be 3% with inflation increase for ground lease.
Yeah, okay,
That's why.
helpful, Justin. I think that comment is captured, and I want to make sure we hear from others as well.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
No, you're great.
Next
That was really helpful. I mean, it's clear that there's concerns about using adjacent land value, which might be higher for improved areas than unimproved ones. So definitely captured that. Let's go to Jim and then Dylan and Mike. So go ahead, Jim.
Hi, I just want to point out that my issue is the formula itself. And I think the formula itself, even though it's now developed 7 years ago by an intern, I think is flawed. And I pointed that out in the letter. I don't, whether you use a market value of the land or the appraised value of the land, and then the modifier, you still get outrageous numbers for a large percentage of leases that we've looked at. And so you're forced to cap it. And, pointing to sort of picking up on what John High said, it's like we are a mortgage that's been here 50 years. We're stuck here. We're not moving anywhere. And so we are sort of captive to the market land value that you're talking about. A land value, I should say, that even the county assessor doesn't use when they're taxing us. So, it all comes down to reasonableness. I think Sylvia sent out an email that said, you want reasonable increases. Well, I'm sorry, but the increases based on the proposed rules are not reasonable for a large number of your leases. And I would point out also that 70% of your leases were flat rate leases. So they weren't impacted by the downturn in market values that you mentioned. Some were. I don't know what percentage were riparian value, but it's a small percentage. So that's sort of a red herring that you talk about. Oh, well, markets could go down and that'll help you. Well, no, we're stuck. So, I think the way I would like to approach it, and I don't know if any other of the RAC members are interested in providing alternative language, but we need something that's reasonable. And when you talk about a 50% increase every 5 years and a 5% increase year to year, that produces numbers that, in my opinion, and it is my opinion, are unreasonable. And they don't match the goal of DSL to provide reasonable increases. So the formula, in my opinion, is the problem. And you talk about 3 to 8%. Well, I've already asked you where those numbers come from, but that is also a problem. You add modifiers that make no sense. If we're in an urban area, you've added 0.5%, but the market value in an urban area is already killing us. So, I would love to know how you came up with those. I'm sure I pointed that out in the letter I sent, or that several of us posted to you. But while we're talking, ultimately we have to get to something reasonable. And I like Justin's idea. He just pointed out that you could have flat rates that are keyed to location, that would be transparent to the lessee, that would be easy to calculate, and that would provide what I would hope would be a reasonable return on what DSL is asking from their lessees. So again, I'm going to focus on the formula. And I guess the next step is talking about the modifiers, but we were told, I'll stop in a minute, but we were told last month that we couldn't use CPI because it came from another source. Well, how can you justify using market rate when it's coming from another source, market value, when it's coming from a county assessor? I mean, maybe that's a minor, small point, but it sort of begs the question. So I guess I'll just stop and say that I'm not a fan of using adjacent land values at all, except perhaps, as Justin pointed out, providing some sort of a tiered system where location is important. But as I said, as a mortgage that's been here half a century, we're not going anywhere. We're stuck, and as are most of the mortgages and marinas in Oregon. So with that in mind, I guess I'll stop for a moment, but reserve my right to come back. But I have one more question maybe for Sylvia. If the RAC comes up with alternative language, how do we just submit that and then DSL blesses it, rejects it, or approves it? Is that how that works?
Well, I'm actually going to turn it to Blake to answer that because that's more in their court than mine.
No, you nail on the head, Jim. That's how it would work. If you have language that you'd like to propose, you can propose it, and then we'll review it. And either bring back amendments to it, or just depending on what the language is. So yeah, we would be the ones that would review it and kind of bless it. Like
yeah, and maybe I'll just add as well. I think Blake was going to talk about this a little bit more in the next steps, but DSL also needs to bring any proposed language modifications to their managers. So I think the next step too would be to bring any input from the RAC, including ideas for changing the language, to the managers for their kind of discussion as well. And then that would come back to the RAC. Like, here are the changes that seem like are doable, and these are ones that maybe are not doable, and we can discuss that at a future RAC meeting.
Are the managers part of these meetings? Are they listening in?
That's a good question. I don't know if we have a manager in. Everybody's available or allowed to listen in. But yeah, I don't believe that we have anybody in there right now.
Okay, so I would just like to reserve the right to provide an alternative language at some point in the near future.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Please do, Jim. Absolutely. Okay. I would encourage it. Okay. I think we still had some hands up,
yeah,
Sylvia.
Let's go to Dylan next.
Yeah, thanks. Always difficult conversation. So as I've mentioned before, for the city of Portland, I run a number of similar programs. And one of the things I was looking at is OAR statutes. And there's some information in there about sale or lease of submersible lands that I didn't really see in the proposed draft language. I also put something in the chat. The state has some, guidance on appraisal methods that could be referenced. The most difficult conversations we have often as government bodies when setting rates, when we're talking about lease rates, they fit into two buckets for me: residential, non-residential. So the state has Measure 50 and Measure 5, which are designed to protect housing stock. And so I couldn't support anything that, didn't have similar methodology to what's in place for the county for increasing taxes and those sorts of things when it comes to increasing rent. Even you'll see it in California and stuff right now with the fires. Those increases in rent, I think, are something that are easily justifiable as protected. Now, on the contrary to that, it says that in most legislative ORS or for, in my case, city code, that we have to sell or lease at market rate or to the highest bidder. So otherwise it's a gift. So our job as governmental regulators is not to incentivize necessarily, it's to create the balance, right? And so I would say that residential needs to be treated somewhat differently. Commercial, when the city signs a commercial lease, or when anyone else signs a commercial lease, it's governed by those same rules. I think that there are usually comps involved. So the comparable properties is important. So adjacent property is fine as long as it's comparable. Otherwise, sometimes you have to justify that in other methods. And the percentage of that, I think, is something that very often we hire consultants to help map that out. And so perhaps there's an appeal process on that, but when we reset industrial rates, they're reset to market. Otherwise, it's a gift. And so I think that there are some real problems with, kind of flipping the table over with a new rule. And so oftentimes we have a phase-in period. And I think that some of that is written into the draft language as well, to the extent that it solves the issues. I would say that it's always going to be a bit of an imperfect fit, but I would say that if we're following a market standard for industrial leases and it's supported with, state guidance for appraisal methods, and it is for commercial purpose, that, those are all things that exist today that we can map back to and that are easy to support unless you're trying to create some new, rule that would be hard to defend. And so I guess my comments really come back to with big changes, you want to take it in phases when possible. As public entities, we're required to use market rate. How we get there is difficult, but with residential, I think it's pretty clear and easy that if we lose housing stock, it's a problem. And I'm not saying the current system under Measure 50 and Measure 5 are equitable and hitting all intended. There are lots of problems in some of those areas, but it's established and it's existing, and we're using other things that are already in existence. It's not a double tax as far as I'm concerned, but it's the same sort of thing when you extrapolate over into rent, using some of those guidance that the state has on rent control, or restrictions on raising that rent. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dylan. Mike?
Last but not least, just a couple of quick comments. One, I've heard a few things in the last 20 or 30 minutes thrown around in market assessed, and I want to make sure that I understand from DSL it's assessed value, because we're throwing market value around like it's based on market value, and it's not. It's assessed value, which is usually much less than market value in most counties. Rarely is it market value. So is that a correct statement, Blake?
Mike, the rules state that the adjacent land value is what we would use is the real market value, the RMV, of the land, not including improvements. So it would just be the underlying land. Any improvements that add value to it would not be included in the valuation of the land. But we were looking at the real market value and not the assessed value or the Measure 5, Measure 50 capped value. We felt those are values that are created for tax purposes and not for the valuation of the actual land. And so that's why we were looking at the real market value of the land minus the improvements, because we're trying to, value unimproved land. So to include improvements in the valuation would not make a lot of sense, or didn't make a lot of sense to us.
Right, but if I recall, your assessed value from the county will show you the assessed value of the property, not the structures. It separates it out. So where I'm going is, have we looked at that to see what that? I mean, maybe that's where we need to be looking instead of market value.
Is to go to assessed value? Yeah, that it was a comment.
Value,
yeah,
instead of market, because it's misleading to me in the worksheet that we got for showing it, because it doesn't say the adjacent land value is real market value. It just says based on county assessor, which is misleading to me.
Okay.
So I don't understand. That's why.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, Mike. I'm not trying to interrupt.
Sure.
Please continue your thought. Sorry.
Nope. Go ahead and answer.
I was just going to say that we're singling out the county assessor because they also set the real market value of the land and the improved structures. So that value, the real market value, is set by the county assessor as well. And in the rules, we define what is adjacent land value. That's the real market value of the land minus improvements as set by the county assessor. So maybe we could have been, we probably could have been a lot more clear, because we are having this discussion. But that was our intent, is the real market value. But we're open, to discussing using a different valuation. I think that is a good thing to bring back to executive team to see, if that is, an adjustment that we can make instead of using the real market market value, but the county assesses the assessed value. The problem that we found is not every county will tease out the assessed value of the land and the assessed value of the land or the improvements. And so then we might end up we would have to figure out how to tease out the value of just the land, because that's really what we want to do. We don't want to include improvements. So does that help answer?
Yeah, that helps. And I would just say that whatever's decided in the future, let's say it on the formula worksheet, because it just says assessor. I was just looking at it. It doesn't say real market value on there. If that's what we're basing it on, let's put that on the sheet so we all understand that that's what we're saying.
That's great.
Yep.
And as we move, I got one more comment. As we move forward, I am still fuzzy. I know these meetings are spaced out a month apart, and I brought this comment up before. I'm a little fuzzy on goals and outcomes. I feel like we're being asked to give comment, to provide feedback on how we should move forward or what we see, but I am still not clear on the goals, why we're doing this, what are the outcomes. I know I heard I used the word last time, it seems like things are arbitrary. What is the goal? We have to have a goal, right? The DSL is doing this for a reason, and I would hope that they've identified goals and outcomes of this proposed rate change. What are they? They should be guiding this process. And I, again, don't feel like they're real clear to me. I don't know what everybody else feels, but I feel like we're jumping in feet first. I saw things like, I can't remember, DELF or whatever the grant program is. You want to put more money into the grant program. Well, how much more money do you want to put in? And I can't remember how in depth we got into that discussion, but me personally, I can't help with the discussion until I understand what we're trying to get to and what the goal of the program. I remember we discussed in the first meeting, is the goal to, we're losing money on this because it takes so many resources and funds to process applications and it's not working. But those types of things we need to understand so where do we need to get to? There's got to be something.
All right, Mike, just a recap. I went over some of the objectives in the beginning, and the whole point of this proposed or these proposed changes is to make sure that our lease rates, right, are they're reasonable, that they're based on the market, they account for the activity and the location. Those are the things that we're trying to do. We're not trying to get to a number, because I don't think that would be really appropriate for DSL to say we need to generate this much money. So right now, what we see is the market, or rather not the market, but the flat rate method that we use, substantially undervalues the use of the land. It doesn't compensate the public correctly for that use. We have marine industrial users that are paying $450 a year for the use of state-owned lands, and so we don't feel like that is equitable to the public. They should be compensated fairly for the use of that land, and so that's really what we're trying to do is create a methodology that allows us to come up with rents that do that are reasonable, they're market-based, they account for the activity and the location, and they compensate the public fairly for the use of that submerged and submersible land.
Okay.
That's helpful.
Sounds
And
good.
thank you, Mike, and thanks to everyone who commented on this. I know there were a few other topics for the lease calculation that we wanted to get to. Some of you have already brought them up, like the 5% annual increases, the 1.5 cap, and kind of the modifiers or adjustments to the rate. So I want to get to some of those topics, but before I do, there are some folks that haven't weighed in on the adjacent land value. So I'll just pause to see if anyone else has comments on that. Just want to see. Well, thank you for that discussion. So maybe next, should we move to the annual increases and the cap? Maybe we could talk about those together. Blake, I'm looking at you to see what's the most important topic to make sure to get input on.
Sorry, unmute myself. I think that's a good place to jump off to, and then we can talk about the modifiers as well as the rental rate range, because it seems like there are a lot of questions about the annual increases to the fees and the rent.
And maybe Blake, just quickly, do you want to remind everyone of the proposal? What what is annual increase and what is the cap?
Yep. So annual increases, we are proposing setting at 5%. When we looked at CPI over the last 5 years, it was, I believe, 4.25. And if you look at CPI over the last 2013, so that would be 12 years. Believe it was like 3.33. I do want to address the reason why we're not specifically calling out CPI, and it's not because it's from another source. We accept other sources of data for lots of reason. It's specifically because by placing it at CPI, the DSL, relinquishes its authority to set rents and to set them at a rate that accomplishes our goals and objectives, and that's the advice that we've been given by Department of Justice, and I think it is perfectly reasonable for us to talk about having a different rate than 5%, but unfortunately I don't believe we'll be able to get rules out that would specifically tie CPI in to rent increases in rule. And that is something that is above my decision-making authority, and I will happily bring up this comment to executive team as well as the Department of Justice when we go over that review. And so but I don't foresee a different outcome. So I think the area of discussion would be what is a better percentage to use, and is there other language maybe that we could add that would provide flexibility perhaps in the future to adjust that percentage without having to go through an onerous rulemaking process. So Jim.
Yeah, as I pointed out in my letter to you, I think another division in DSL has just approved rules that call for a 3% annual increase. So how do you justify 5 when someone in your own department is accepting 3?
Yeah, I have no justification, honestly, for that, Jim. I'm not part of that rulemaking. I wasn't part of, that's a completely different program in a different section of DSL, and I didn't even know that they were suggesting a 3% increase. But all I can say is what has been told to me and what we are, or what is within, our authority. We're also talking about different, not to get too into the minutia, but these are different lands that we've received through different means, and they are directed at, they have different objectives for, their rules. So the lands that are discussed in Division 126 that you mentioned, the special use rules for communication sites, those are trust lands that are specifically dedicated to the Common School Fund. They are required to be charged or charge rents at certain amounts, and they have a different objective entirely. So
yeah, but the point I'm making is that their objective for the 3% was to cover inflationary costs, and so is your objective. And inflation is going to be the same for both rules. So I just don't understand how you can say with a straight face that 5% is required for submerged land leases, where 3% to cover the same inflationary costs Make it clear, it has nothing to do with the land they're leasing. It's only to cover inflationary cost, and inflation is not changing. So my point is that this should be an easy one to give.
Yeah.
Really.
So then Jim, maybe just to cut the chase, what would be your proposal for kind of an annual increase?
3%. I mean, you've used 3% for years without complaining, apparently, and someone else in your organization is using 3%. And I would probably challenge your calculation of CPI. You can always cherry pick years to figure out CPI, but over the last couple of decades, I think 3% is probably is quite fair and reasonable, and it's transparent and it's easy to calculate. So I think that's a slam dunk, easy one to give the RAC. My point.
All right, Jim. I will say that I wasn't saying that we're required to do 5%. I just said that,
I understand. We just have to make it justify it then.
Yep.
If you can't justify it, then it shouldn't be there. That's my point.
Okay. I appreciate it. And to that end, I will state, I did a calculation of what were our fees, back in 2013, right? What are our current fees and our proposed fees, and then what that change would look like if we put it through CPI and not a 3% increase, which is, for our square foot rates, our flat rates, and our minimum rates, we did and still do increase them by 3% annually. So I did a comparison, and CPI would have generated higher fees across the board.
I'm not suggesting CPI.
And that was at 3.3393, I believe. It was CPI from January 2013 to now. So I don't think 3% would keep up with inflation.
Blake,
because we've used 3% since
I'm sorry to disagree, but that several years in the time period you've chosen had unusually high inflation, unusually high, which has now come down to under 2 or around 2.2, something like that.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is this: I don't believe you can justify 5. That's my opinion. I would stick with 3, and then move on to the other parts of the formula that we can actually discuss. That's my point.
Got it.
Well, thank you, Jim and Blake. And maybe let's just hear from others as well. Dylan, I saw your comment in the chat too that ODOT leases are at a fixed 3% increase as well. So that's helpful information. Garrett, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so can you confirm this is just about the application fee, not the lease price? Is that right? 5% annual increase in an application fee?
It would be both. So I don't think I went through the whole summary, but annual rent increases would be proposed at 5%. And then application fees would also increase by 5%. And increases at the time of renewal would be capped at 1.5 times whatever the last rent was. And that's a cap. It's not a mandatory increase. So it's not required at renewal that we increase the rent from whatever, that last year was paid to 1.5 times. It is just that if that rent increases more than 1.5 times that last year rent, it would be capped at that rate of 1.5. In addition, we are proposing caps, annual maxes of 150,000. So leases can't exceed that. And then that would increase to 175,000 after 15 years. So that's I believe it was a 1.5 multiplier from so.
Yeah, so Garrett, any thoughts on that, or was it just a clarifying question?
Yeah, I thought it was just about 5% on the application fee. And I was going to say that regardless of, there's a lot of different arguments you could make about the long run rate of inflation, whatever that aside, like if you wanted to, it seems like you could calculate your program costs for reviewing applications and sort of calculate an application fee increase based on that if you wanted to do something other than a sort of even round number, but I don't have strong feelings on it one way or the other. Thanks.
Thanks, Garrett.
All right, others, and maybe just sticking with the 5% increase as a topic. You know, anyone in like want to make arguments in support of sticking to 5%? You know, I know today we've heard that 3% from a couple of people makes more sense. I think at the last meeting, there was also a call for a lower percentage or to use CPI, but it sounds like that could be complicated here. So, you know, what do others think?
I support the 3%. I think if you average out the CPI and other inflationary tools, it's closer to that than it is to 5 over time.
So I guess my question, I'll get back to, sorry, I'm going to beat this drum, but again, goals and objectives. You know, if you give on the 5 and move it to 3, are you going to go back to the formula and add points to that? Because you said at the beginning of this, you know, we're trying to get the fair value of the people's land. Well, you've kind of determined that through your formulas and the things you've done to date. So are you now going to go back to the worksheet and change another figure in the formula and say, this is what we need because we believe this is the fair value. So if we give here and give 2% back, we're going to take it back over here.
I have no intention to do that, Mike. I can fully state that we would see those as separate things and would not try to recoup those missed 2% in the formula.
Okay. I guess you see the
contradiction I see
that I'm saying here, because obviously you guys have come up with this form and you feel like that's the fair value of the people's land. And now if we are able to be successful to knock that to 3%, now we're back to it's not what you believe is the fair value.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Mike. Thank you.
And Dylan, do you want to expand it on what's in the chat here?
No, just that this really comes down to the political directive and the elected support. So in the past, not present council, but in the past, 5% has been considered aggressive. 3% has always been allowable, but we've seen 5% quite a bit. It's just on the upper end of what you normally see with a public body. So I think 3% doesn't require justification. So for the sake of putting through new rulemaking and having it land and then testing and adjusting, I would recommend 3% as a point where there are bigger things that we do have to address. And if it's found to not be meeting requirements under ORS to be cost recoverable or highest value, then you would adjust it at a later date. But it's a fair first stab, but it really comes down to like, are you gonna like, maybe no one on this call is going to make this decision. So as a rulemaking advisory body, we probably just want to support 3%. It sounds like we might have that or not support it. And then, you know, I don't think it's up to us to make a decision. We're just going to make a recommendation.
All right, thank you, Dylan. Appreciate that. And I know we haven't heard from some folks, so maybe, you know, Lindsay, Laurel, I think Elizabeth, any thoughts from you all on these increases? All right. Well, appreciate that. And yeah, I'm hearing some good input here, especially support for the 3% increase. And maybe moving on then to the cap. So Blake explained the 1.5 times last year's rent cap at renewals. Wanted to see if folks have any specific input on that or suggested changes on the 1.5 cap. Yeah, Jim. Oh, Jim and then Garrett.
Yeah, as you know, I've questioned that cap. I don't, and it's not just at renewals, Sylvia. It's every 5 years, regardless of lease length. Am I correct? So I have two questions, I guess, and I think I've asked them in my letter. But one is why 1.5, and why every 5 years? If you plot the increased rent for, let's say, our mortgage over the next 30 years, it's exponential growth. What you're providing here by doing this every 5 years and doing it 1.5 times every 5 years, you're getting a curve that is not linear. It's linear. It's exponential until it hits 150 grand. And it seems to me that the rationale here is to get to 100, to get to the max quickly. So I don't understand if you're willing to give extended leases, which we will talk about, I'm sure, at some point, and understand the requirements for those extended leases. Why do you feel it requires you to raise the rent 150% every 5 years, irrespective of the fact that it's growing now maybe 3 or maybe 5 every year in the intervening period? So what is the I guess what's the rationale for that? Why not 1.2? Why not 1.1, 1.3? I don't know. Where did 1.5 come from? And did it come from the paper in 2018?
I don't believe that it was in the paper that we should the 1.5. That was not where we derived it from. We just felt like there needed to be something in between renewals, right? That would limit the increases, right, for those properties that have exceptionally high valuations, right? And so, Jim, just to be clear, it is not a required increase of 150%. So if the calculation, if using the formula creates a rate that is only $1,000 more than the last year's paid, that's what the increase will be. It's not required to go up 150%. That's not the rule. The rule is only if that increase exceeds that. And so we did not see in every lease that we calculated those, that increases were exceeding 150%. That was a mitigating factor that we felt like, well, this will prevent rents from, doing what you're talking about and just racing to the top. Whereas before we were racing to the bottom, and we wanted to prevent, continuing to give the lowest value. But we didn't want to just switch it entirely and say, well, now we just want to go, everybody gets charged the max, We didn't look at every lease, but the ones that we did look at, only one, and I know I said this in the woo, and there were definitely more people that, were, would be subject to this, but it would still bear out, I think, when looking at every lease, that it's a rare lease that would meet the maximum. There may be a number of you, and it might all be in Multnomah County. Who knows? But
there you go. I think you hit it on the head. I think Multnomah County is probably the source of your largest income, as I think Bill Ryan has mentioned to us in the past. And that's the problem. We have seen almost every lease we're looking at for a mortgage is going up 150% every 5 years. Now, they may not reach 150. They might reach 110 or 120, but they're increasing every 5 years. And for a mortgage of a 70% fixed income retirees, these are unsustainable increases that you're proposing for a vast majority of your lessees in Multnomah County. And this is why I've asked for the data, because if you haven't looked or can't provide the data that shows how many of your leases are going to be subject to this increase, then it's incumbent upon us as lessees to figure that out, I think, because we have to be able to, again, look at reasonableness. And this again seems like an unreasonable expectation to increase leases this quickly by this much. So that's my point. I don't have, you haven't really explained 1.5. I mean, as opposed to 1.2 or whatever, but that's okay. I just want to be clear that this is one of the big problems that many of us see with your proposed rules is the increased rent that and the rate of increased rent over time. So I just wanted to make that point. I'm sure we'll provide some language that you will have to look at some point, but I still haven't heard a proper justification for 1.5%, 150% every 5 years, irrespective of lease length. That's the other issue. Are you going to recalculate this every 5 years, regardless of lease length? Why?
And Jim, that is to make sure that the rent is tied to the market value, that it stays, to what the market is doing and doesn't deviate.
Okay.
And so, if the market goes down, the rent goes down. If the market goes up, the rent would go up. Those are, what we're looking at.
I doubt the rent would go down, but that's another story. So the other thing I would point out is that in the paper, flat rate leases were considered administratively efficient because they don't require much input by you guys. This technique that you're suggesting of using adjacent land value, using adjusting it every 5 years, to me seems administratively inefficient. And when you pointed out in the first meeting that your staff is so stretched that lease rates are used to supplement the application fee process or whatever, I just want you to think about administrative efficiency of these proposed rules. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Jim. Thank you.
Dylan, over to you, and then we'll go to Garrett if you still had a comment.
Great, thanks. I'll try to go fast here. Good and bad, I guess, agree and disagree with comments. So the rent stabilization, right, out of Office of Economic Analysis I posted was capped at 10%, so 1.1 for residential. So I think much lower than what folks have been talking about is probably very appropriate if they're behind. Like if a lot of these are really low value and they need to catch up. So capping it at 10% is in line with the past 20 years, where the lowest maximum rent increase that's published on that website is around 8.3%. And then if you're, caught up and considered market, maybe it falls back into that 3% realm. Commercial, every lease coming out of Salem right now is reappraised and reevaluated every 5 years. So residential, I think there's a better solution. Commercial, I think, is still somewhat in peril here. Like there are small businesses that are going to be significantly impacted with this methodology. And I think that if, up to, 1.5 could be really damaging on small business. So I would suggest a phase in, but for residential, I think following the state guidance, this is effective rent that is being charged. And I don't think that it would be politically prudent to not follow that guidance for housing on the river.
Great, Dylan, thank you.
I would agree with that. Thank you, Dylan.
Thanks, Jim. And Garrett?
Yeah, what Dylan is saying makes sense. I just wanted to raise, I guess it's previewing the overall caps that are established, that I had some questions or concerns about the equity of those for smaller lessees. And I don't know, it sounds like maybe there's almost no one that would not reach that cap soon based on some other comments. But if there is an ongoing concern amongst other RAC members on like the equity of the caps and it creating an uneven playing field, then adjusting this rate downwards would be something that I would be supportive of as an alternative to having sort of flat rate caps at the upper end.
Sorry, to clarify, you'd support a formula that just allows for lower rent increases rather than caps at all. Is that right?
Yeah, rather than the 140 whatever $1,000, I forget what the actual numbers were. $150,000 caps. Yeah, slowing it down for everybody and not having that sort of arbitrary threshold that some people get to enjoy and others don't.
Okay, thank you, Garrett. Appreciate that. All right. I think next I would want to move to the modifiers and adjustments list, but before we go there, any other comments, and even if you just want to echo what somebody said on the 5% or the annual increases or the caps? Okay, thank you. And Dylan, just do you want to expand on your comment in the chat that flat rates are not a good tool for leasing purposes?
So just anything that's a flat rate, in my opinion, needs to be supported by a fee rate study every 2 years. So permits and application fees, those are things that are commonly done through a fee rate study, have to be fully cost recoverable, and the price is what the price is, and it's not really negotiable. So I think that separating those out and having those be flat makes a lot of sense. The leasing aspect of it, I don't see how you don't end up in jeopardy with, the requirement to be, in the middle, doesn't hold up with flat rates. So administratively, it's easy, it's more efficient, you can do it with less staff, but I think that it's not going to be a sound method. And at the end of the day, we need this to be a stable, well-run, properly staffed organization that provides the level of service that we need. I always say if you provide too much service, you're restricting freedom. If you provide too little, or the quality isn't good enough, we're wasting taxpayer money. So vanilla is always what we're going for. And flat rate for leasing isn't vanilla. It's really, really good for some and really bad for others, often, in my experience.
Thank you, Dylan. Appreciate that. And Laurel?
Yeah, I don't think we're on this right now, but I did want to flag that I did have a question about the 5% increase as it relates to public facility licenses at some point, because I think that's the type of license that State Parks has for public facilities.
Well,
Because
Laurel,
I noticed that it said that there was going to be a 5% increase every year. So I don't know, just was flagging that for something that we wanted to talk about.
so public facility licenses do not have rent. So they are free authorizations. They require an application fee, but that is it. So they would not be subject to the 5% increases because they're not paying annual rent, but would be because the application fees would increase.
Yeah, that was my question. It was an annual 5% increase on the application fees.
On the application
flagging
fees,
that would
is
apply to
correct.
public lands open to the public. Or that was, I guess, my question. I think it would, based on my interpretation of the little footnote in the table.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like there would be an increase in the application fee for the public facility licenses every year. Of 5% is what's proposed. So Laurel, comments, suggestions on that one?
Yeah, I have a hard time because I was waiting to find out how many of those we have from Blake. So if we could get a list of all of those, and I could do an assessment of what the potential fiscal impact would be to state parks from that. I don't know how often we apply for them, or the
It's a
period for that.
15-year
Okay.
term.
Mostly I was just flagging it as something that we would be interested in discussing.
Okay, Laurel, I'm sorry. I thought that I had gotten back to you on that, so I'll circle up with you on that. Sorry, apologies.
No worries.
Thank you. And Jim, did you have another comment?
Just a quick question for Dylan. I really appreciate Dylan's comments. And as a committee member, we don't often communicate internally with each other. So we're always sort of bouncing things off you guys. So Dylan, with your experience, what do you see as an effective solution to the rate issue. I mean, if you're not looking at, if you think flat rates are not the way to go, how would you go?
Well, I think I said most of what I have to say about this in my prior statements, but lease rates need to reflect real market value for commercial purpose. There's a number of ways to do that. I always map back to how our organization does that same thing. So it's easier for constituents to know how our entity behaves, which is why my recommendations were for the state to use similar as applicable policies or guidance documents where appropriate to justify the methodology. So it's squishy logic with leases, and a lot of times they're negotiated. I don't think that that's really useful for this few leases with a small staff. So having something mapped back that is updated by other departments makes a lot of sense. So I guess I don't have the solution. My input is more, I think it should be defensible. I think it should be like other things where appropriate. And I think that residential and commercial need to be separate. And I'm excited to talk more about the percentage of use because public facilities have become complicated. And I don't want to not be paying in just because I have budget problems right now for those facilities where there is commercial use taking place at a recreational facility. And more, we're going to need to have commercial use at recreational facilities as everything gets squeezed, especially within Multnomah County.
Thanks, Dylan. All right, well, with our time left here, I do want to move us to the modifiers and adjustments list. So I think Danielle's going to put that on the screen. Can everyone see that okay? I think maybe if you minimize the ribbon, we could see a little bit more. You could zoom in a little bit, but Blake, do you want to just do a quick reminder of what this is? You don't have to go through each one in detail, but just what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so there, a list of, modifiers, ways in which the rental rate can be adjusted. And, we looked at how we currently review applications and the meaningful questions that we ask on those questions or on those applications about the activity and the use and how we have applied those different type of activities, how we viewed those different type of activities rather historically in a kind of a hierarchical manner, seeing public or rather personal recreation use as low or minimal impact, and then these other uses, or rather uses kind of escalating from recreational to non-commercial to commercial to marine industrial to non-marine use. So that was how we historically viewed uses and how and how they kind of affect the land. And so we try to capture that in the rental rate modifiers, the activity listed under 03, 05, 12, and then some like location based modifiers that are listed in 03, 05 sub 3. So there's probably a little bit more than you wanted, Sylvia, but
that's
the
great.
best I could do.
Yeah, that's helpful. And so for some of these modifiers, they increase the rental rate a bit, as shown with the pluses, or decrease it a little bit if there's a minus there. So I'll turn to the RAC to see if folks have input on these modifiers. Are they reasonable? Are there certain specific ones that are more challenging for you? Would welcome any comments. Lo and behold, we have a hand up from Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, my mom told me I was vaccinated with a phonograph needle. Anyway, yeah, my first question is really the screen that should be shown before this screen, and is where does the 3 to 8% come from? Can you give us a reference where that was found and justified?
Well, when we did a review of other states and how they, you know, set their rates, for example, Washington uses a rental rate of 3 to 7% for commercial activities. I don't know what off the top of my head what California uses, but our current rules set a rate of 5%. And so we use that as a, you know, kind of guideline. When we assess the riparian value method, we use, you know, 5% to kind of as a rental rate to come at a square footage rate. And so we saw, you know, we wanted to be able to adjust that rate, and we wanted to be able to adjust that rate like meaningfully. So we felt an adjustment of 3 to 8% was a reasonable range, given that 5% was, you know, current practice.
Okay, so in the individual modifiers, then do those meaning the numbers have meaning, or were they just selected? I'm not saying randomly, but
Yeah.
how were they selected?
Well, they were selected so that we, you know, I also don't want to say arbitrarily, but you know,
It's
given
okay to
that,
say arbitrarily.
yeah, but given that the range is 3 to 8, and you know, given you know the importance of the separate factors, you know, knowing that non-marine use is typically you know has a higher liability for us, you know, because it's often an apartment complex or a large you know structure that doesn't need to be over water. That if you know something goes wrong would pose a significant risk to the department. So those are you know things that we want to capture, and you know whereas personal recreational use is a minimal risk because you're talking about a much smaller structure, and you're talking about a far different use, you know, its frequency and intensity. So those are you know how we kind of determined or got at the percentages and saying, well, what would affect the rate enough to account for, you know, how meaningful that factor is to us when we review an application and when we make an agency kind of resource decision.
Right. So these these modifiers are significant. I mean, in terms of the final number that you get, as you know. And so I was just, are they maybe I missed something. Are they defined in the rules?
I believe that we provide gosh, well, let me pull it up.
Like,
They
I mean,
can be. That is not an
what does zoning
impediment if they're
mean?
not
What
already.
does location mean?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff.
We do not go into the nitty-gritty of all. So for example, the zoning, the beneficial waterways program, we mention it, and we mention ways, for example, the waterway designation, we identify, you know, what those instances would be in rule. For example, if it's an essential sail-mounted habitat, or state scenic waterway, or other marine protected area, then that would kind of trigger the waterway designation. I think that's like good, you know, critique coming in that we could provide the actual definitions in rule. Right now we have a, you know, explanations in this document that we provided for each of those factors. So for example, Danielle, if you scroll down, we kind of go into more detail for each of these. So when would we use zoning? What do we mean by beneficial waterways program, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
But for our use classifications, those are defined in rule. They have definitions. So we do have definitions for those use classifications. Excuse me.
So floating home moorage, why is that considered commercial?
Because it's, I mean, if it's an individual floating home, then we wouldn't consider it commercial. We would consider it a non-marine use because you're living over a waterway, and it's not, you know, it's not a a marine required use. You don't have to live on the water.
But I'm confused. If you have one floating home, it's not commercial, but if you have two or more, it is?
If you operate a floating home marina where you solicit people to live inside a marina, or you offer those services to them at a rate, at a fee, you charge them a fee to have their home there in your structures. I don't know what your lease rates are for that, but you provide a commercial service, which is, um,
If you're a
in the
nonprofit,
marina.
so our mortgage is a nonprofit corporation. Doesn't that sort of imply that we're not in it for monetary gain? We're just in it to cover costs?
If that is the case, if you're a non-profit, then we can, look at how the, proposed rules affect nonprofits. But the idea is that if there's commercial activity, right, if you're conducting activity for commercial gain, then that's commercial. And, if you're a nonprofit, then that is a different conversation, Jim.
Okay, thank you. That's basically what I had to say. Thank you much.
You're welcome. Absolutely.
And Dylan?
Yeah, thanks. This ties right into what I've been talking about, where you have two things here. You have residential units that are going to have to cover these costs, and it's going to affect housing if it's not done carefully. And there are commercial elements, right? And so when you have a nonprofit, sometimes they do commercial, sometimes they're not. So if there's a general store or a cantina, right, or like per square footage, commercial is commercial, right? So I have recreational docks that need to pay something because we lease space out, or we want to lease space out, but we still want to have a public benefit for 3/4 of the area. But because there's either like you lose, this group that provides access to the river permanently because of costs, right? Or you diversify. So I definitely want to pay fair share by square footage or by percentage. And I think that when you have large, groups of houses on the river, that same sort of logic does need to apply. You can't just, the end result is that we will lose housing. And so I couldn't support something that knowingly would reduce housing. And those are fragile ecosystems. Commercial purpose, like maybe the general store closes because it can't afford the rate. That's unfortunate, but you're not necessarily losing the housing. And over time, a business model can be built up to where maybe it comes back. But I think that once again, if we don't separate those two things out, it's going to be really hard to support the path forward.
Well, typically how we handle multi-use areas right now is we parcel them up. And so by the use. So we say, okay, here's the whole leasehold. And this area over here is marine industrial marine service, but the rest is commercial marine and moorage. So those are two different rents that they would pay. One for the marine industrial marine service, and that would be calculated, separately. And then one for the commercial marine and moorage, and then add those two together, and we have a total rent.
And I guess then we would focus on the commercial rate, because in this case, or in many cases, it is housing. So it might be a commercial, entity because it's an HOA or whatever, it's formed, but it's still housing. So I think that we'll end up spending a lot of time talking on that. Perhaps there's a new line item where it is residential as a category, and that helps it. But the end result, and I think why we're going to have a lot of comments on this, is that we're impacting housing, and that has to be treated differently, just because it's treated differently everywhere else, right?
Current rules or HOAs would fall under non-commercial activities because they're seen as, homeowners paying rates. And so we would continue that interpretation. So perhaps we can think about broadening that HOA to include other types of associations or organizations that aren't really trying to create commercial gain.
Well, and I think there's something to be said about having formal organizations for liability and risk purposes, right? You don't want four entities, existing with under a license, and that's going to, be a change as well. But the key element that I'm really looking at here is we really want healthy waterway access and recreation. And one of the things that's really missing is it's really hard to get public access on a lot of these leaseholds. And there's a significant benefit to the public and the community when there's more waterway access, especially when it's safe. And having a recreational rate within a commercial space when it's appropriate to be able to basically like a lot of times people will partner with the city because they reduce their property tax, right? The same should apply to a waterway lease. If you provide a boat launch or a paddleboard or kayak launch, and the public can go down and it has this 50 by 50 area and a few parking spaces in the parking lot for access, and it's left open. Like every one of those that were around had new restrictions placed during the pandemic. Getting them back open requires incentivization, and I would say it would be a huge miss if we didn't heavily incentivize commercial purpose to allow public access when it's safe and appropriate.
Got it. I appreciate that. Those comments. Those are really good. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you. And Mike?
Yeah, I'll add a comment to what Dylan just said. And I was going to discuss this, but he's kind of hunting down the road I'm going, I think. In previous meetings, I've discussed, public ports and special districts, and we are a public entity. And I caution, the way we're treated now. I'll give an example. I'm looking at our lease for our marina. We have a marine. We're designated for 3,500 square feet of marine industrial, marine service. And then we have our ice house out there. That ice house is for public benefit for our commercial fishing fleet and our recreational fishing fleet. We operate at a loss. Our entire marina operates at a loss and is heavily subsidized by the tax base. And it just seems counterintuitive for public entities to have to pay a marine and commercial rate. We are not commercial. We're tax exempt, no different than the county. So the county, we do not pay county taxes when we operate our business lines in our marinas and our facilities. If somebody comes in as a private entity and leases some of that facility, then they have to pay county taxes while they're there on that piece of property. But I think it's something that we need to look hard at, and where public ports and special district ports of the state fall in these things. Because again, we don't do this. We're same thing. We're nonprofit. We're not doing this for commercial gain. And again, we like many of the ports on this coast operate our marinas at a deficit for public benefit. So.
That's helpful. So Mike, is there any specific suggestion you would make to this list of modifiers to kind of get at your concern?
I think to be honest with you, I think you almost have to have a special, not a set aside, but where you're talking about special district public ports.
Yeah, special carve out where you guys would have your own rate. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And again, by no means, if there's commercial activity, just like I said with the county taxes, if we have people leasing something over water, or if somebody took over the ice plant and it was a private entity that was leasing it from the port for profit, that changes the game, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate it.
And Jim?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Dylan has said. I like that idea of incentives, and I see one incentive here for the Beneficial Waterways program, and anytime you can incentivize the behavior of an organization, I think it's useful. I would also point out that when you guys calculated our rent, as we asked, and others, you always used the commercial for morages. So anyway, I'm glad we clarified that, and that we can maybe take 1% off that rate when we're calculating future rents. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Just FYI, current rates for non-commercial marina moorage and commercial marina moorage are actually the same. It is more to do with the type of insurance that we end up requiring for non-commercial versus commercial uses. So the rates are the same. There's like 3%, 3 cents a square foot, somewhere in that neighborhood. Under the proposed rules would be different, but that's what I'm saying. Current rule.
Okay, thanks. And Alan.
So I wanted to agree with Dylan, but kind of make a distinction from what Mr. Ryan was saying. So I think that, public access is beneficial. But I guess where I'm looking at it is, the waters are public property. And so anything that benefits and allows the public to gain access and use that waterway is beneficial, but anything that restricts the public access should be at a cost for taking away the public right to use the property. So I'm less concerned about the commercial or non-commercial motive. But if it's restricting public use, public access, there should be a fee affiliated with, that private restricted use instead of private use, but effectively the marinas, the homeowners, they're restricting access for public. So they should have some, reimbursement to the public for that exclusive use. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. And typically how we've parsed that under current rule is that, public facilities, don't pay rent, these that provide public access. And that is why typically floating homes and other structures, regardless of whether they're commercial or non-commercial, are handled under leases because they're a certain size and they, don't allow the public. It's an exclusive use of that area, of that portion of the waterway, of that submerged and submersible land. So, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
All right. Any other comments on these rental rate modifiers?
Hey, can I say something?
Yeah,
please.
go ahead.
Yeah, so this seems like one area where you guys could get like kind of bogged down on each lease, especially with other methods or information on a case-by-case basis. I've kind of gone back and forth thinking like you should consider not having these at all to keep it simpler. But then I think of sort of extreme cases also where it could be useful, like a new major marine export terminal where you want to make sure that the public is getting compensated for the sort of extraordinarily valuable use of submerged lands. So I mean, overall, I'm okay with it. I think one thing I just wanted to ask clarification on was for the zoning. How does that work? I read the example note below the table and had trouble understanding how that would be applied.
Yeah, the intent is, when the zoning doesn't match the use over submerged and submersible lands, I think it should be 0.75. Oh, thanks, Danielle. I appreciate it. So if you have commercial activity adjacent to residential property, right, then the zoning for the residential property doesn't match that activity that's over water, or when you have, upland zoning that is, heavy commercial or heavy industrial operations, gravel mining or paper mill or plywood plants that would pose more of a risk, right, to the submerged and submersible lands, due to the nature of their activity. And to touch on on a case-by-case basis, if we scroll down, the intent of that, other uses is for the director to implement that. That would be something where the director would say, hey, there's some issue with this activity that is, that would fall under other methods or information. It's not something that we would intend, low level or mid-level DSL staff to be able to use or implement. It would require director approval. So kind of puts it at, a much kind of higher level. It is not something that we or any other agency would take lightly. If something requires director approval, you don't just bring anything to them. You've got to bring something that's pretty pretty well substantiated. And to get back to also whether or not we should have listed these out or not, I feel what you're saying there, Garrett. What I didn't want was a situation where we provided too much discretion to the department for these types of modifiers. So I wanted to list as many in rule so that we wouldn't leave future DSL employees the unenviable task of having to walk out on a plank on their own to just justify one of these or any factor, coming up with their own factors, coming up with how that would adjust the rental rate. So we wanted to really provide as much clear direction and rule and in guidance that we would publish that helps show the public how we use these and what's the purpose of them. So.
Okay. Can I ask one more question about one of the examples mentions the areas that are within the Coastal Zone Management Act, with Oregon's coastal zone?
I'm sorry, Garrett, you broke up a little bit for me. What was the question?
Sure. It's about one of the location factors being whether or not the location is within Oregon's coastal zone that is part of the Coastal Zone Management Act. And I was wondering, do you guys have to submit, do you guys have to go through like Coastal Zone Management Act reviews with DLCD on your leases?
Yes, we do. If we have a new proposed activity, then we would have to go through that review, but renewals are not subject to that.
Okay. All right. It sounds reasonable then to cover or sort of reflect the extra cost with a little bit of a modifier there. Thank you.
Yeah, I will say one caveat. When I did say renewals are not subject, but that would change if you had a change in use or an increase in use that requires a land use compatibility statement from the city or the county planning authority. That would then have to go through a coastal zone management review by DLCD. So that would be the exception. So, but most renewals, you're not looking at a change in use or activity or a change in size that would require that type of review. So, thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I know that we're probably due for a break, but I want to give an opportunity to see if there's any other comments on the rental rate modifiers. All right. Well, I am showing 10:55 on my clock, so maybe let's try to get back together at 11:05 to continue our meeting. All right, welcome back, folks. That was a really quick break, but we have an hour left here, so hopefully we can make good use of our time and you can get to lunch or a longer break. Okay, so that was really good discussion on the lease rate calculations. I think we all know that's kind of the toughest topic for this rulemaking advisory committee, and really appreciate the input there. When we get to the next steps piece, I think we can talk a little bit more about what DSL is going to be doing with all of your input. But in the meantime, we'll move into the other topics for today's meeting. So next, we're going to get into the financial assurances requirement. And just a reminder, we touched on this very briefly at the last RAC meeting, so kind of need a little bit of a refresher on this. So I'll hand it over to Blake, and this will be a pretty quick topic, so we have time for our next one. Go ahead, Blake.
Great, thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you, Danielle, for pulling that up. So just a reminder, the proposed changes to our financial assurance requirements, we were proposing adding requirements for new and renewing waterway registrations. They're intended to ensure that structures over Oregon waterways are protected from risk associated from being on the waterway and due to the nature of whatever activity is authorized. Currently, registration holders are not required to obtain insurance, which would protect against bodily harm, death, or property damage. So it leaves these structures at risk. So we want to add that into our rules, which like I said, are not currently there. Danielle, can you go to the next slide, or maybe pull up the financial assurance language? Maybe best to do right now. So we've touched on this briefly, like Sylvia said prior, and we got some great feedback from folks. And so what I did is I took that feedback and I reworked the language for the financial assurance. And what I intended on doing was creating a new rule for financial assurance, and pulling that out of the lease and registration rules and putting them under one rule, so that those other sections would then just reference this, and these requirements would be both for leases and for registrations. Prior to this, if you remember right, or remember correctly, the proposed language was about 3 sentences long. It was one subsection or one section, and just allowed us to require financial assurance, or other, require financial assurance that's acceptable to the department. We would determine the amount, and we mentioned the acceptance of sureties. And so what I did is I teased out, those sentences, as well as added some more from our Exhibit B, which is the exhibit that lists in the lease the insurance requirements, and it has particular requirements. For example, that insurance providers would be subject to the department's acceptance, and other changes like providing proof of coverage, or providing copies of insurance policies or endorsements or self-insurance. And then we added also a section, or a couple of sections concerning surety requirements. So listing conditions in which we would require a surety, as well as stating, and I don't think it's in there. Oh, as well as stating we incorporated into the language, sorry. As well as stating that sureties would require director approval to use. So shows that the bar is pretty high for requiring a surety, and wouldn't be something that we would just use in our everyday lease agreements. Let me see. Oh, and then the last is just retaining, right, that a certificate of deposit can be supplied in lieu of the financial assurance that we require. So that's a brief summary of the changes. I would like to hear some initial thoughts, and really, I think the conversation is probably going to revolve around the surety and the uses. But I'd love to hear what people's initial thoughts are to the proposed language. And I know that this is not a whole lot of time to digest it, right? So we can pick this up in a future RAC. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got a number of topics to go over, but I think there's space for us to continue conversations either from this meeting or future meetings. So
Great, thank you, Blake. Yeah, so open it up to RAC members. And Dylan, I see your comment in the chat. I know you had brought up the concern about the surety requirement last time, and it looks like the language is looking better for you. So appreciate that. Feel free to expand if you have other thoughts. Anyone else, any concerns about this kind of insurance requirement? Okay.
Well, if we
maybe
don't
I'll
have
ask-
it.
Well, I
Oh,
was going
sorry,
to ask, yeah,
Sylvia.
do folks feel like they need more time with it and would like it to appear on a future agenda, or is this just, this is a pretty minor topic. So if it just seems okay, we can say looks good and move on. But, I want to provide opportunities if folks think they need more time.
Took the words out of my mouth. Thank you, Sylvia.
I think it might be useful to just circle back one more time for the next one to see if anybody's got any further comment after going through it. But at this time, it doesn't leap out as a big red flag to me.
Great. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I think that's what we should do. I'll just briefly go over then the section 6 for the surety requirements. We identified a number of circumstances in which we either do require sureties now or we would if the situation came up. So, for example, if the applicant or holder of a lease or registration is in default with any other authorization or permit granted to the department, then we may want to look at a surety. There might be issues with their ability to fully meet the terms and conditions of the lease or registration. So we may want to see additional assurance with a surety that would, kind of alleviate any issue that we had. And in addition, it was previously sent a notice of deficiency or default by the department that could include, notices of failure to pay rent, because that's one way in which lessees get into default is they miss their rent payment, and now we've had to send them a notice to make payment. And in situations where we see, year after year where people fail to make their rent payments, and we are having to issue interest and late fees, that's a cost and burden to the department. And we have at times used sureties as a means. So if you're not going to pay your rent, then we can possibly collect on the surety or use the surety if we find you in default. And then the last two, there has current or past business, financial, or management practices that indicate they cannot fully meet the terms and conditions of a lease or registration. This is also a reason in which we could deny use is, because past business practices or management or financial practices, are troublesome. And so we would, under those circumstances, maybe require a surety to, kind of alleviate those concerns. And then the last would be if there's active construction related to the activity that's, in, upon, under, or affecting the lease premises. So, if you're new construction, there would be, perhaps there's a spud barge, perhaps there's other, equipment that's present, and we would want to see it. Typically, we see sureties used during construction to help cover any of the risks associated with the active construction. So that's was our thinking in making those changes. So I look forward to continuing this conversation in the next RAC. We can carve out space. Though if I do get enough people that are saying, hey, we reviewed it, we have no concerns, perhaps that conversation would be a little smaller. But review between now and the next RAC, and either send to me or Justin your comments or concerns, or bring them to the next RAC and we can discuss them there. So
Great. So we'll send this language out, Blake.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Great. Well, any other kind of questions or comments at this time before we move on? All right. Well, let's go to Justin Russell then to present on a new topic. So we're going to be talking about the application review process. And again, Justin will provide kind of the background and what's proposed in the rules for this. At today's meeting, we might have some time for some questions and a little bit of input, but really want to have a more robust discussion at the next RAC meeting. So over to you, Justin.
Awesome, thanks. So in general, a lot of the changes that have been made to the application review process for leases and public facility licenses are really kind of attempts at housekeeping and kind of good customer service. So we've really, the intent is kind of to make changes that clarify kind of existing process and removes duplicative language from kind of different sections of rules and brings them all into kind of one place so that, the public, when they're looking at the rules, or DSL staff looking at the rules, we can kind of easily interpret and apply them when we're reviewing applications. In that light, we removed the preference right process from the existing rule section and gave it its own rule. So that's kind of a change that's there. We also consolidated the reasons that DSL may reject or deny applications into one section. Previously, there was kind of different reasonings and rationales spread throughout rule and statute. This kind of puts them all in one location so that kind of, again, everyone's on the same page when looking at DSL's rules. And then we've also added some criteria for the public comment process that just helps DSL better define what comments are considered and what our expectations are when we reach out to our applicants for responses to those comments. So these are kind of the new or more defined reasons that DSL may reject or deny the application. So in those instances where the application doesn't include necessary information requested on the application form, and the applicant has not responded to a request for that additional information within 120 days, the department may reject or deny the application. And then if the proposed use that's suggested in the application doesn't conform with the provisions of the rules, the Division 82 rules, DSL can also reject or deny. Again, these aren't new reasons. These are kind of reasons that are already spelled out in rule and other locations or in statute. These are just kind of us trying to put it explicitly out there in one location so everyone understands what the expectations are. The public comment criteria, these are kind of newly defined. I think previously, the rule just specified that the application, a new application or an application with changes would go out for public comment, but didn't necessarily specify what types of comments the department would consider. This new list is kind of an encapsulation of the comments that DSL really focuses on currently. We're not looking at comments about barking dogs or things kind of outside this scope. So really our intent here is just to set the scope so that we're getting comments that are useful in our review and that I think we can reasonably ask our applicants to respond to if comments are received. Go to the next slide. So in the preference right and competitive bid process, so again, this kind of rule was pulled out of its existing location and given its own rule section. Most of that language is largely the same, but we did try and pull over some language from statute that really specifies what a bid must contain if we're going out for competitive bid. So that bid just has to contain an application on the department's application form specifying a use and activity. It needs to include an application fee, and then it needs to include a specific amount that the bidder will pay for rent. Again, this isn't a change. It's just a better defining of what's already out there in rule and statute. We did add some language kind of hoping to clarify when public bids are not required or when the preference right process is not required. So for those leases that are in the process of renewing, if they're in good standing with continuous authorization, those kind of those leases are not required to go out for public bid and go through the preference right process. For applications to modify the lease, I don't, where the intent is not to require a preference right process in those instances, unless for some reason the use area is expanding so that it maybe the new use area goes in front of a new tax lot. In those instances, there would be a requirement to go out for preference right and public bid. And then for those applications where the applicant is the preference right holder, we're just making that clear in rule that we would not require, the preference right process to occur. So in our rule section discussing the renewal process, we did put some definitions around when our lessees are expected to apply for renewal. So the expectation kind of going forward based on the rules that we're proposing is, not less than 180 days and not more than 1 year before expiration that the lessee would apply for renewal of that authorization. So we also defined when a new application fee would be required, even on renewal. So if there's a change in use, or a change in the leasehold, we would require a new application fee, and we would require kind of going through that public review process and the preference right process if it's applicable. And then if an application fails to submit an application within 90 days before the expiration of the lease, the department would treat that as a new application as well under the proposed rules. And I guess this is just going back on what I said before. We're clarifying existing process. So renewal applications that include a change in use or a change in the usehold would be processed as new applications. And then, yeah, again, I think this is kind of just rehashing what we said previously. But yeah, I think that's the end of kind of the major changes. This is kind of intended to be kind of a high level overview of the changes in these rule sections. I think our hope is that the RAC members will go maybe look specifically at those rules and maybe bring any comments or questions or suggestions to the next RAC meeting to discuss. Most of the changes, like I said, are really just changes in, trying to specify things better, trying to improve the readability of the document. But we're obviously still very open to, comments or questions that might be out there.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate that. So I'll open up to the RAC for questions, comments, and also if there are pieces here that you want to hear maybe more about at the next meeting, that would be helpful to know so that the team can kind of prepare additional slides or material if there's stuff that's of key interest to you. Let's go to Dylan and then Laurel.
I just want to make sure I understand, because the 180, 90, or 100, I'm sorry, the less than a year or less than a year, more than 180 days puts this weird window where if you try to renew in between 180 and 90, are you submitting a new application, or is that still an acceptable period? I was a little bit confused by how that's running out because, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, but perhaps there's a better way to clarify it, but we would accept an application, outside of that time period, except for, more than 1 year. We really don't want to entertain renewals outside of 1 year before expiration. But if we were to receive an application 90 days before, of course, we would accept that. It would just be that a new application fee would be required and not a renewal fee, because we're now running up 90 days before expiration of the
Gotcha.
lease, and that's not really not a viable timeline for us to execute the lease before
Yeah,
expiration.
so it's just an app fee between 180 and 90, but no
Correct.
like resetting of fees or new application. After the 90-day period, though, it sounds like they might be getting a new, like let's just say you're on a legacy rate. If you submit a new application for a new lease, like you're brought current. So there's this real jeopardy between 90 or less than 90 days if you haven't submitted, right? Or if you forget to submit, you know, that would be the cliff to watch out for, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And just to remind everybody, the fees that we're proposing, right? We're talking about $1,000 for a new application and then 500 for a renewal. So the fee would go from, if you submit it less than 90 days, would go from 500 to 1,000.
Oh, so you're still able to renew off of your existing lease.
Correct.
Oh,
Yes,
so
but
it's
we'll
not
run
yeah,
into the
okay.
issue where we're now after expiration when we're executing it, and that requires a holdover. And so there's a lot of administrative tasks that we then have to do. So we don't have to go perhaps to DOJ to get a sufficiency review or, God forbid, ratification, you know. Is that good? I mean, our intent is to
Yeah.
provide a letter reminding people, hey, don't forget, here's the renewal. And we've got it scheduled where, you know, at certain times you'll receive a second notice, a third notice, a fourth notice. So we're really trying to telegraph and remind people, like, this needs to get done. Here's the resources to do that. And you know, regardless of whether it's a new or a renewal, it will require an application, and it is the same application. You'll just note on there that, hey, this is a renewal, and I provided it within the correct time frame.
You took away all of my my concerns. Thanks.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dylan. And Laurel, I saw your hand up.
I think all my questions were answered. They were process-related questions related to the 90-day thing and whether there was notification. I just wasn't aware of the process. So you answered all my questions as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank
Great.
you.
Lindsay, I don't think we have anything set right now, but current practice is, yeah, to kind of send something out, what is it, 6 months prior. We would look at sending it out a year, right? So at the, you know, a year before expiration is likely when people will receive their first notice for renewal. We can obviously look at sending it a little bit before. I know personally, the more emails I receive in my personal email inbox, the less I enjoy reading my emails. So you get like that, you know, real just I don't know, I can't remember the right term for it, but you know, you can get fatigue, email fatigue, or notice fatigue, you know, if you're receiving letter after letter. So we want to thread that needle of informing applicants enough and not getting to the point where they are so annoyed with our messages that they, oh my gosh, another letter from DSL, good grief. So
Great, thank you. Jim?
I'm just curious, how many applications for renewal or new applications do you receive a year?
It varies. I don't have the numbers in front of me because they are on like a cycle. It, you know, not unheard of to, I would, well, I don't want to take a stab in the dark. Give me 1 second, and I can pull up what,
I was just curious, and
yeah.
And do the fees you're proposing to charge, do they cover the administrative work to get these applicants done?
That is our intent, is that, you know, the application fee covers the administrative cost to the department to do that. And, you know, we're about a year and a half into our study, and the initial results for application fees kind of show that, you know, our current fees are in line with what our administrative costs, given the way that we've calculated our administrative costs. You know, so given the formula that we're using, which is essentially, you know, staff's hourly rate at a percentage based on the amount of work they would perform for any one given application. And so adding up all the staff time kind of gets us in, you know, what our fee proposed, or the cost to the department, you know, so.
Yeah, I was just curious because in our first meeting, you mentioned that lease rents were subsidizing this process. And are you suggesting that they won't be subsidizing it if you succeed in getting these rates increased, these application fees increased?
I mean, that's the intent, Jim.
Okay.
I can't say that it will be successful because I don't know the future. But that's what we are intending to do, is to cover those administrative costs. You know, there's other work that staff do that's outside of renewing applications, right? Or processing applications. And so obviously some of the DSL costs are not really going to be captured in these application fees because it's not the work that those staff members are doing. So we're not intending to recoup other costs to the department, you know, that don't involve reviewing new and renewing applications.
Right, thank you. Alan?
So I think it's next meeting, we're talking about lease requirements, but I was curious on the renew, is this gonna include like the process you go through to renew the lease? And specifically, I'd like to see some requirements added to the lease, but if it requires a physical inspection, should that be contained in this portion, or is there another section of the rule where that activity should be included?
You know, it could be both, Alan. I think that requirement could be in this renewal process. We could also, you know, or not we, but you could make a suggestion to add it to the general lease conditions. So a condition of the lease, that's a whole section, which we'll go over in a future RAC.
Right.
So that section, we could add it in there and say, as a requirement of any lease, you have to have an inspection either at, you know, the time of renewal or the time of application or during some period within the lease. So here or there, you could make it a condition of the renewal application or the application itself, or you can make it a condition of the lease agreement. So there are two ways that you probably could handle that. And I would leave it to you as to what you know, because you know, for us, I mean, it's not my suggestion. So Alan, if you want that a requirement of the application, then this would be an appropriate time. And if you want it a requirement of the lease, then the general lease conditions.
So I think it's important at some point that DSL needs to go out and physically inspect their leasehold. And I guess that's my concern. Where and when you do it, I would defer that to you guys.
Got it.
And so I think it's, you know, if you want to have it here, lease renewal, that makes sense. Or if you want to do it as a condition, you know, I'm good with either, but I think it's important that you actually get out and do the inspections. So
would agree with the hang up that we often experience is if it is a requirement of the application, then that could possibly create a bottleneck for our work. And that, you know, because of the number of applications that you're processing, a coordinator might not be able to get out in a timely manner to do an inspection, and that could hold up the process, which is not something what we would like to do. Right now, what we do is, you know, every coordinator creates a schedule, and it's an ideal schedule of here are the leases in my area, and, you know, here's a schedule for, you know, doing an inspection. And it's, in the neighborhood of 100-ish. Well, that was our previous regions. I have not done an accounting. We've, changed the regions that we used. We now use 3 regions instead of, I believe we had 4 or 5. So the numbers work out a little bit differently, but typically people have about the same number of leases to inspect, and we like to see that in a 3-year time frame. Just full disclosure, I don't believe a coordinator has met that schedule, and it is not because of effort. It is just a sheer matter of time. To really meet that schedule, you would have to be going to, site visits 3, 4 times a week, and we just don't have the capacity to manage that. So,
That's helpful.
Great, thank you.
absolutely.
All right, and Mike, I see your hand up, but first I just want to note there's some comments in the chat from Justin and Laurel, so I just want to see if you want to expand on any of that.
Yeah, let's see. What is the comment?
Pointing to Justin, anything you want to, you noted that the process for implementing a new platform.
Yeah, I don't think
Just-
anything beyond the
Okay.
comment. Yeah, so we will have a new system in the next year or two probably that'll allow for more automatic notifications for things like lease renewals and rent and all that fun stuff that we send out.
Perfect. All right, thank you.
As far as making sure the contacts are up to date, we do our best bet. We do our best effort to make sure that when we are communicating, that whatever form that we're communicating in has the most recent information. So every year we're billing, so an invoice goes out, and when those communications come back, that's an opportunity for us to update. We also, send out annual notifications that people should be in compliance with their insurance if we don't have a certificate of insurance on file for the lease. So there's a lot of communication that does happen during the year, and that does help us update our contacts. But in the end, if we have bad information, it can be difficult to update it if that person is not receiving those communications. So, but in those rare instances, we use LexisNexis or some other database. We reach out to the Department of Treasury, and those folks help us, identify, okay, based on the information you gave us, Mr. Helm is newest contact information we have is XYZ. And so we'll use that to try to continue communication. But it is really important to us. So we do make every effort in the life of an authorization to get the most recent information.
Thanks, Blake. All right, and Mike?
So I'm going to take us backwards a little bit. Blake, thank you for giving a little more detail on the discussion of covering administrative costs. While I think we did, in the first couple of presentations, we kind of danced around that, but you gave a lot more detail. Is that a formula you're going to share with this group of how you're coming up, whether that's sufficient enough to meet it or not? But again, that's the kind of goals and objectives and details that I think are necessary for the team to evaluate whether things are reasonable and not reasonable.
Oh, and you're on mute, Blake.
Sorry about that. I'm happy to share the formula, Mike. I'm hesitant to share the data behind it because it is scattered over all of our authorizations. So it's really not the best indicator for what the costs are to our department because they're heavily influenced by outliers. But in general, what we're seeing is consistent to what we've thought our costs are. Like easements are more costly than licenses. Access agreements are less costly than leases. Things of that nature. So it is showing that, there's more work on certain authorizations. But like I said, there are outliers, easements that took 80 or 160 hours of staff time, which is really not an indicator of, the, what normally would occur. So, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But happy to share the formula that we've used and what what staff costs we're including in that. So.
And I appreciate that. And if you can share that, just the assumptions that you used as well, right? So obviously you had to understand how many you're renewing every year, and we saw some of those numbers earlier on, but that'd be nice to understand. Thanks.
Absolutely. Just in general, I guess I can provide a little bit more context. What we do is every coordinator, when they're done processing an application, goes through a questionnaire that identifies how much time did they spend on it and what were the factors in either it taking more time or less time, and then anything else that would be special about the application that was be needed to, is needed to identify. So that's how we're capturing the data, and coordinators have been great on plugging in when they're done with an application, and so we're getting more and more data. It's just going to take a little bit of time. I think it took removal fill close to 5 years to get enough data to feel comfortable that they had a statistically significant amount of data points.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments here on the renewal process? All right. Then we will pick this topic up again at the next RAC meeting. And like Justin said, would just encourage folks to look at the rules related to that in advance of the next meeting so that you can come with any comments you have. And with that, we'll move into interested party comments. So I know we have a few folks on the line. Maybe I'll just ask now, if you're a member of the public interested party that wants to make a comment, can you just go ahead and raise your hand in the platform? Again, go to the bottom and find the react button and click raise hand, and we'll see if there's anyone that wants to make a comment. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone, but maybe if you do and you can't raise your hand, just go off mute real fast and let us know. If not, then I'll move on. All right. Well, I don't see anyone, so we'll move on, but I appreciate everyone for listening in today and continuing to be engaged. With that, we'll just go into our next steps. So I will hand it over to DSL on this.
All right, thank you. And thank you everyone for your discussion today and taking time out of your schedules to join us. As was mentioned earlier, DSL staff will be meeting with ARM, that's the Aquatic Resource Management Program managers, to discuss outcomes of today's meeting, most notably your discussion about the compensation method, and then any potential changes that should or could be made to the compensation calculation. In the next week, like before, a meeting summary will be sent to the RAC members and today's meeting reporting will be posted. And then, as always, prior to each meeting, a meeting agenda will be sent. And all of these meeting materials will be posted to our rulemaking website. And this includes the language for the financial assurance that will be posted. We'll make a note that it's new proposed language to be folded in. So it'll be its own document. And then I'll discuss with Blake and Justin about if we want to actually put that into the proposed rule language that we had originally sent out and repost that. So we'll probably do both. And if you have any questions or communications with the RAC, make sure to send it to Sylvia. She's our point of contact with DSL. It's definitely okay to send stuff to Blake and Justin, but it's easier to send to Sylvia because then she can coordinate with us and other RAC members. So thank you very much for your time today.
Great, thank you, Danielle. And since we have a little bit of time, just going to check to see with the RAC if any questions about the next steps or any kind of final comments before we let you go. All right, yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Has DSL notified all the leaseholders that this process is ongoing?
Yes.
Thank you.
How
I was
have
going to
you
ask
know-
Danielle to answer that. So
How
Yes.
have you-
And
you
information
know-
was sent out. I believe that emails were sent, and for folks who we didn't have emails, that a postcard was sent. It was handled by our community engagement officers a couple months ago, so I don't have the specifics off the top of my mind, but I do know that they were contacted to let them know that rulemaking about all of this was happening, and they were directed to our rulemaking listserv to sign up for notices about the RAC meetings and other rulemaking activities.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mike?
Yeah, I just want to take a second before we got off the call, and I appreciate DSL's work on all this. I know none of this is ever easy. You're putting yourself in the spotlight and you're asking for more money, so it's never a popular topic. So again, thank you for all your hard work.
Thanks for saying that, Mike. And thanks, Dylan, for your thank you as well in the chat. Great. All right. Well, anything else, Blake?
just a big thank you. Appreciate you guys having this uncomfortable conversation with me and being very nice to me throughout it. So appreciate it and look forward to next month. And if you have any questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out to the appropriate person. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.